Okay, so given these endpoints as being x1, y1, x2, y2, what's the midpoint? So you add your x together. And remember, the midpoint is a point, right?
Yeah.
So we're talking about a point. You have to have an x coordinate and a y coordinate. So the x coordinates will be x1 plus x2 divided by 2, and then y1 plus y2 divided by 2. And then we saw that the distance is given by the square root of, and then you subtract your x's from each other, and I do what to that? Square them. And then you subtract your y's from each other, and you square. All right, now, several things I gotta remind you, or let you see if you remember. See, I have x2 minus x1. Could someone have put x1 minus x2? Yes, because you're squaring it. So whether you say x2 minus x1 or x1 minus x2, when you square it, it's the same number. All right, so it did not matter which order you subtracted the x coordinates. Does not matter. Okay? All right, so there are the two formulas. All right, number one. The first part, you're going to find the midpoint of each. Find the midpoint and the length of each segment. All right, so you find the midpoint and the length of each segment. All right, so number one, you have the coordinates 3, negative 15, and 9, negative 3. So 3, negative 15, and 9, negative 3. Now, when finding the midpoint and the distance, the length, it's always a good idea to label those coordinates. In other words, if this is going to be your first point, then this will be x1 and this will be y1. This will be x2 and y2. So it does help if you do that. And so therefore, let's find the midpoint. So the midpoint, remember, is a point. So you need parentheses, okay? And you got to find your x coordinate and then find your y coordinate. To find the x coordinate, you got to say 3 plus what? 9 divided by 2, comma, and then what? Negative 15 plus a negative 3 divided by 2. And so what's 9 plus 3? And what's 12 divided by 2? 6. What's negative 15 plus the negative 3? And what's half of that? Okay, y'all agree? So that's your midpoint. So the point that's in the middle of that segment is 6, negative 9. Okay? Now remember, it's a midpoint is a point, so you need to know it as a point. An x coordinate, a y coordinate. Let's find the length of that segment. So let's find the distance. So this will be the square root of, you just plug and chug, just like you did before. Plug and chug. x2, what's x2? 9. I'm going to subtract what? 3. What do I do with that? Square it. Plus. Next one is what? y2, which is negative 3, subtract what? Subtract what? Minus 15. Squared, right? Okay, now let's remember something. The first one's easy because what's 9 minus 3? Are we squaring 7? So I'm just going to rewrite it. Now, some of you have an issue with this that I'm writing, negative 15, this negative 15. So remember, when you subtract a negative number, that means the same thing as adding the opposite. So that's negative 3 plus 15. What's negative 3 plus 15? 12. So that's plus 12 squared.
Wouldn't it be 6 and not 7?
Say it again?
6 and not 7?
Yep, you're right. Okay, thank you. All right, so 9 minus 3 is 6. Okay, now, what's 6 squared?
36.
Plus, and what's 12 squared? 144. Now, here's where some of you are going to make a mistake. You're going to say, well, 36, I can write this as square root of 36, which is 6, plus 144, which is 12. That's not true. Okay, do not make this mistake. Do not say that's the square root of 36 plus the square root of 144. You cannot do that. You got to add and then take the square root. So what do I get when I add? You said 180? Okay. And so there's your distance. Now, they are going to ask you, though, they will say simplify. Okay, so let's simplify this. We got to determine a perfect square that goes in 180. There may not be any, but let's see. Let's try 4. Will 4 go to 180? Yeah, because it's what, 45? But it's not the largest, but if you're not sure, then still use that. Still say square root of 180 is the square root of 4 times 45. Is that right? And what's the square root of 4? 2. So I have 2 square root of 45, right? But what perfect square still goes in 45? 9. So I can say, well, that's 2 times the square root of 9 times 5. And what's the square root of 9? So I get 2 times 3, which is 6. So I get 6 square root of 5. So it turns out that the largest perfect square is 36. Because look, 180 divided by 36 is 5. But, you know, many people would have just looked at this like we just did and said, well, 4 will go into it. But remember, you can't stop at 2 square root of 45 because 9 can go into 45, so you got to break it down. So they are going to ask you to simplify this. So if you get up to that point, you get most of your points. Now you get 0, but you want to make sure you know how to simplify. Now, also, there might be a situation where they might ask you to approximate as well. So on your calculator, approximate square root of 180. So square root of 180. Did you get something like 13.42? If they tell you to round up to the second decimal place or the hundredths, 13.42? Or you could have done this one, couldn't you? 6 times the square root of 5. 6 times, and then the square root of 5. And you get the same thing, 13.42. Okay? All right, so that's midpoint. Any questions on midpoint with this problem? Notice we have to simplify. You have to simplify. I'm sorry, distance. Midpoint distance. So distance you have to simplify. Notice the midpoint's a point, and the distance is a number, just one value. All right, number 2. Number 2, suppose you had this. Suppose my coordinates are 2, 3 and 4, -1. 2, 3 and 4, -1. So again, it does help if you label. So let's call this x1, and this will be y1. Then this will be what? x2, y2. So let's find the midpoint. So remember, midpoint is a point. So you have an x-coordinate and a y-coordinate. To find the x-coordinate, you add the x's together. So it would be 2 plus 4 divided by 2, comma. And then 3 plus a -1 divided by 2. So what's the midpoint of that segment? What's going to be the x-coordinate? 3. And over here will be what? 1. So 3, 1. That's your midpoint. Distance will be the square root of. All right, so you subtract your x's together. You subtract your x's from each other. Does not matter the order. So if you want to say start with 4, you can. You would say 4 subtract what? 2. So 4 subtract 2 squared plus, you want to start with -1 for the y? Does not matter. -1 subtract what? 3 squared. What is 4 subtract 2? 2, but I'm squaring it, so you do get 4. Plus, what's a -1 subtract 3? -4 squared. Okay, -1 and -3 is a -4. What's 2 squared?
Four.
So I get 4 plus, what's the negative 4 squared? 16. So I get the square root of 20. All right, let's simplify the square root of 20. What perfect square goes into 20?
Four.
All right, so the square root of 20 is square root of 4 times 5. What's the square root of 4?
2.
So I get 2 square root of 5. So that's your distance. Okay? All right, number 3. Suppose you had these, negative 1 comma 2 and 2 comma negative 4. All right, so again, label your points. It does help. x1, y1, x2, y2. So the midpoint, remember the midpoint's a point, so you need the x coordinate, y coordinate. So that's negative 1 plus 2 divided by 2, and then 2 plus a negative 4 divided by 2. So remember, you add them. Distance where you subtract. So that's going to equal, what's negative 1 plus 2? Huh?
1.
1. So you get a half.
Yep.
And then 2 plus a negative 4 is negative 2 over 2, which is negative 1. So that's your midpoint. All right, and then distance, square root of. All right, you subtract your x coordinates from each other, so you'd say x2 minus x1, so 2 subtract a negative 1, whatever that is you're going to square, plus, and then negative 4 subtract 2, and whatever that is you're going to square. What's 2 subtract negative 1 the same as? 2 plus 1, which is 3. I'm going to square that. A negative 4 and a negative 2 is a negative 6. I'm going to square that. So I got the square root of 9 plus what? 36, which is the square root of 45. And I can simplify that. Yeah, so he went further, but what perfect square goes into 45?
9.
So that's
3.
9 times 5? And what's the square root of 9?
3.
So that's 3 square root of 5. Okay, so any questions on using the midpoint and distance given endpoints? Okay, all right.
Wouldn't it be 15?
Why 15?
Because you took the 3.
3 times 15?
Yeah.
But is 15 a perfect square? You want to use perfect squares. That's why we chose 9. Okay?